and then we always just normally have our whatever if we need to discuss anything beforehand. But obviously, you guys had discussions while my technical issues were making me pull my
It's just
hair
a
out.
shame that we weren't recording it, because I think the brochachos, that's our nickname for our patrons, would have got a real hoot out of that. Like not hoot,
Yeah.
like laugh, but I think it would. I think it was substantial, and it's their loss.
The guy who was the technical director for a while having some hardcore tech issues. Not hardcore. It's one of those things. Like it was video was freaking out. So unplug, replug doesn't recognize it. Okay, whatever. It's the dongle that I'm using something. I restart. I open the program just to double check, because usually it works. I don't have to open the settings and all that stuff. I open that up. Oh, it's installing an update. It might be weird for a little while. So I'm like, oh my gosh, really? This has to happen when I don't set up beforehand. Anyways, and we have someone on that I'm taking up their time, and I'm doing the same thing right now as I'm rambling. So
no big deal.
We'll press on through. This is what Nate was talking about, our super high tech, once again, former tech director guy way of getting ourselves hyped, of playing our own theme music before we roll into the episode. And actually, wait, am I introing this episode? Because
you can if you want, man.
I got nothing.
I told you the other night when we did, if you have a bit, then you have a bit, and if you don't, just like do the cold open, like just don't.
Sorry, I was thinking SNL when you said cold open. Okay, yeah, I'll just say hi and it'll be awkward, and that's okay. That's my life. So here we go. Literally holding up my phone to the microphone. Hey, loggers, welcome back to another episode of the Backlog Breakdown. I've got no jokes for you. It's been a while. We've had this streak going where we open with a joke, and I don't have anything. I'm sorry. You were thinking it's what, September? This might come out in October. Who knows when this will come out? It's towards the end of the year. Bet you didn't know that today, for your ears only, it's St. Patrick's Day, because today we have on a special guest with liked that. That's awesome.
That's good. I'm here to stomp some snakes. Let's go.
Yes. I like it. What, he was Italian, right? And then just
Irish, I think. I'm neither of
by
those.
the Irish. Okay. Yeah, I'm
both
actually.
Right. There you go.
And then half Mexican, but you can't tell because I'm the whitest out of all my parents' kids. Anyways, my name is Josh. My co-host is Nate. He's here too. He doesn't laugh at my jokes because my jokes are bad. But
No, I don't. They're terrible.
He's not a dad yet. He'll get it soon. Okay. Well, we're looking forward to that time. But we also have on a special guest, Mr. Patrick Miller. You are indeed a saint, good sir. Thank you for taking the time to chat it up with us, and I'm excited for some of the stuff. Even just talking a little bit beforehand, post technical issues that I was having. I'm loving some of the stuff that I'm hearing so far, and of course, stuff on Twitter. I've heard you on other podcasts, so excited for the night. I hope you are too. I hope you're not too deflated by everything that's happened thus far.
I'm so pumped to be here. I never get to talk about video games in a serious way, or not frequently in a serious way. And I think what you guys are doing on this podcast is needed, and it's thoughtful. And I'm excited that there's people like you out there that are trying to have this conversation, because it's not happening in other places. Well, it's happening in other places, just not frequently enough, not loudly enough. And so my prayer is that God continues to use what you guys are doing and what's happening inside of your community, even if it's, a small community right now, to continue to expand that and grow that, because there's a lot of young men, young women who want to think Christianly about video games. And so this is so important.
Man, you just made my day.
I feel special. I don't know. Like,
don't worry, Nate, you are special.
Oh, I don't like that reference. Oh man, that makes me no, that's thanks, man. That's
Yeah.
pretty high praise. You know, I don't respond to praise well. Like I think that's just that sort of like that East Coast like Yankee thing. Like I don't know what to do with that. I'm just
You
kind of like,
just say thanks and move on.
yeah, I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, cool, thanks. So,
That's
um,
awesome.
but yeah, and we'll get into this here in a little bit here. But a while ago, I came across one of your tweets. I really liked it, and I started interacting with you a little bit, and that's when we started sort of talking about maybe having you on an episode. And I'm just excited that you're here, man, because that like I've since that Twitter sort of exchange, I've been following you. I've sort of caught up on some of the stuff I listened to that episode of is it Redeeming Productivity with Reagan Rose?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you were on that, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that conversation that you guys had. And so I'm excited that it's to find somebody out there who sort of, and again, when we were talking sort of before we started recording, I said like sort of doing that unsexy work of just
Mm.
because it's easy to sort of dip into like the flashier bits and to just sort of fanboy out from time to time, and we do that, but it's also sometimes like being like trying to be the adults in the room, trying operative word, um, is not always fun. So, um, glad to have you on the show. And,
Yeah, thanks
I
for having
guess,
me.
yeah, yeah. I guess though, Josh, I do have a question for you. Well,
Yes.
actually rather I have a little, you know, it's been 2 weeks since I talked to you. Actually, it's been an undisclosed amount of time since I talked to you,
Yeah, that's
but
true.
it's been. So, how you been, man, since we last talked?
It has not been as long as it usually is, but already there a lot has happened. It feels like it's been a little bit of a blur since we last talked. So funny story. This is the first time that happened. 3 kids in. My oldest is about to be 7. Our second oldest, our little firecracker, Josephine. After church, we were hanging out on the playground yesterday, and 10-15 minutes in, she falls off the monkey bars and breaks her arm. So we go to urgent care, and that was the first time that we've ever had to deal with a broken bone in the family. But if it happened to any of our kids, she has the highest pain tolerance, and she's been a trooper through it all. It's been awesome. Like I'm super surprised at how well she's taken. I imagine the next few months are going to be difficult for her because she won't be able to like climb on things and do a lot of the things. And we also have a little 2-year-old, so we need to keep her away from the broken arm for now. But yeah, so that was fun. Kind of wading through that and just I'll give just a little anecdote. Is when it happened, she was crying, and I was actually watching her when it happened, so it's not like it was unsupervised. She was having a good time. She just fell off and landed a bit too hard and put her arm under her in a way that shouldn't have been. Like it wasn't too crazy. But she's crying, ouch. And I look at her arm and it just looks off. It looks a little weird. And so I'm thinking like, is something, it's not swollen, it's not purple. Those are the things that I'm thinking it would look like, but it didn't. But it just looks a little off. And yeah, so I'm a little paranoid. Like, am I just being paranoid? So like second guessing myself. So I pick her up, I take her over to my wife, and I'm like, is this normal? Like, is this weird? Kind of like trying to gather my wits as well. And she's like, no, no, that's not okay. We need to go to urgent care right now.
Hmm.
Luckily, there is a place right across the highway from our church, so it was a quick process. And like she's recovering really well. It's all good. It's just it's been kind of a whirlwind. Today's a holiday, and we figured that we'd take it easy. But yeah, yeah, that's my life. That's what it's been since we last talked. So how are
Oh,
you
dude.
doing?
Um, I mean, well, I shared it. I actually tweeted out about it. I was so disgusted. And then I shared it in the Discord. But yeah, so 3 or 4 days ago, noticed like a thumping kind of like coming from my car. And I was like, and I did some Googling, and I went back and I looked at my rear tires, and I didn't notice anything sort of off the top of my head. I'm like, okay. And it just, and it's kind of, and I did some Googling, and it was like, it's probably like a CV joint or something like that. And I was like, but didn't like that. So yesterday I was out running some errands, and the knocking got like super aggressive. Like every time like I'm moving, I'm just hearing bang, 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 like this, not like thump, 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 thump. And I'm like, this is like starting to freak me out a little bit. I noticed like the Jeep is handling a little funky. And so I get home last night and I look at it, and I'm like, I'm looking at my rear driver's side tire, and I'm like, I'm missing 2 lug nuts. I was like, oh, that's not good. When I parked it, and I said, well, I'll deal with it tomorrow. And I go out there today and I look, and I'm not missing 2 lug nuts. I'm missing just like 2 posts, like the pins that the lug nuts were attached to are no longer there. And the tire was like, I went and I tightened everything. I'm going to take it to the garage probably tomorrow. My wife and I are just going to have to like do like the one car thing. I'm going to have to take her to work. And, but yeah, I about stroked out when I saw that, and it was like, I was like, oh, cars are awesome. This is super great. I'm so glad. But I mean, it was one of those things where, like I said, I tightened up the other 3, got those snug. So I'm going to get it down to the garage. And it was like one of those things, nothing happened, but I was just like, but yeah, I mean, other than that, like, God's good, man. Like it didn't, the tire didn't actually come off. I am a little worried about damage to the rim, but I'm just, for now, cars are awesome, and, but Patrick, you have never been on the show before. So instead of just filling us in on sort of how things have been since we last talked to you, why don't you sort of take this opportunity to sort of share with our listeners a little bit about yourself? Like, give us like the maybe not so quick version of who is Patrick Miller?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't wait until Jesus tells me. But until then, I'll give you the short version, and I'll try to make it relevant to this podcast. I became a Christian when I was 19, and like a lot of guys my age, I grew up playing video games, loved video games. And like a lot of gamers, hated middle school because I was miserably awkward and felt out of place. And while I played games before middle school, there was one game that I picked up called Final Fantasy VII. I don't know if you ever heard of it. Mm-hmm. And I played the PC version, which is a much hated version of Final Fantasy VII. I didn't know that at the time. It was the first RPG I'd ever played in my life. I'd heard of Final Fantasy because I read Electronic Monthly religiously in the school library because I was trying to avoid where all the kids were congregating in the lunchroom. And, I had this profound experience playing that game. I felt like I was surrounded by a group of friends that I really desperately wanted to have myself. I went through a lot of school transitions. So I think I was at 3 different schools in 3 years. And so that'll make you a little bit of a loner, especially when you're, 13 and you're growing into your body and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And it was a group of friends who were helping each other not just figure out who they were, but they were giving each other hope, and they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. I mean, in the climax of the game, really the game's about survivor's guilt, in my opinion, because every character survived something awful and is trying to wrestle with what happened in the aftermath of that. Whether it's, Barrett, selling his town out to Shinra and, having to wrestle with what happened there. But that's what the game's about fundamentally. And at the end of the game, and I know this isn't a spoiler and the game's old, so just, fast forward, I guess, if you're desperate to avoid that. But the main character says, we're not going to go do this final fight until you find your reason for why you're fighting. And every character explains from their story arc essentially how they got over this survivor's guilt and why they were fighting for the sake of the planet. And each answer was different. And I bring that up because when I became a Christian when I was 19, I was in a deeply depressive place. I was lost, and I didn't know why I wanted to live. I mean, just it didn't make any sense to me. It's kind of a lame story. There was a girl, and she cheated on me, and all that kind of nonsense. And but she was my life. She was my existence at the time. And when I lost her, I thought there's no purpose here. And then God surrounded me with this group of Christian friends that I did not mean to have. And, in my darkest moment, my literal darkest moment, one of those friends called me on the phone, and it was really a phone call from God where he was waking me up and saying, hey, maybe there is no purpose to life. Because I was just like, we're on a pale blue dot floating through the middle of the universe. So if my life's over, it doesn't matter, because in 100 years, no one will remember me. And if I'm this miserable, why should I keep going? I mean, what's the purpose of it? And this friend called me and said, hey, I feel like something's wrong. What's going on? And through those friendships that God gave me, it drew me to himself. He really, Jesus with flesh on, he really came to me through those people, and he gave me my reason for living, my reason for existing. And of course, that's him, and the ultimate hope that sin and evil and destruction and everything that's ripping apart our world really isn't the end of the story, that there's a greater end to the story, that Jesus has accomplished the final victory and will return again. And that's the story that I found my life in. And so, it's kind of funny reflecting on this game that had a profound impact on me as a kid, and how that game, in a sense, I didn't think about the game in the moment, but I can reflect on it and say, wow, that same story repeated itself in my own life. And that speaks, in my mind, not just to the power of games, but to the reality that we all live in stories, and that God is the greatest storyteller, and he has a role for every person. He's got a role for us all to play in that. And what a profound gift that is. So that's a little bit of my background. Right now I'm a pastor, I'm a podcaster, I'm an author, I'm a writer. I do mostly cultural commentary. I write a lot about technology. So social media, the metaverse, Web3, and video games are something that I care about as a medium of art as well. And something I've had a hard time writing. I write in a lot of different magazines and places. They don't want me to write about this topic, which I find really interesting. I've tried, trust me, I've thrown the pitches out. It's like, no, I'm not really sure about this one. You really want to go down the gamer route, man? I'm like, yes, I do. I really do. So that's a little bit of my background. The podcast that I do is called Truth Over Tribe. It's mostly cultural commentary, but we talk a lot about technology, metaverse, some of that stuff. We haven't talked a ton about games on there. But that's kind of my thing. So there's my that wasn't short. I said it was going to be short. It wasn't short, but there's my background.
I think you're sort of fitting right into. You've probably, you did say you've listened to the podcast, so there's a tagline that sort of comes out that we are really good at being bad at brevity. So you're feeling our vibe, man. You're feeling our vibe. But yeah, well, like I said, awesome. I had engaged with those tweets, and it's just been yeah, I'm excited about tonight, and it's been a pleasure so far to get to know you a little bit tonight. So yeah, man, we're glad to have you here on the show.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to meet you guys.
Yeah. It's time, Josh. I think there's another sort of the forms must be followed. It's time for a little bit of a backlog report.
A report. Yeah, I've got my report here.
And again,
all the things just to report on.
The most technical Foley work. Just
to report on.
So much good radio. Much wow. Patrick, since you are our guest, why don't you go first and just sort of fill us in on a little bit of what you've been playing, what you've been reading, what you've been watching. Kind of, doesn't have to be anything too profound, but whatever you got, man, whatever you got.
So I'll pick one thing, and if you want to press in more, we can. I actually just finished up Live Alive, or is it Live Alive, or is it Live Alive? No one knows, because there's truly it's an unknown. I think it's Live Alive personally. I'm kind of a retro gamer, and that game never came out in the West, and they remade it in the 2D HD style, which I am a massive fan of. I've played every 2D HD game. I will play every 2D HD game. And what's fascinating is like this it's a remake of a 90s game that was incredibly experimental in its own time. And today it still feels experimental and modern. It's really charming. It's unique. You play as all these different little lives in the game, and each era, they're from different times. Each era is unique, like totally unique. I mean, the combat mechanics kind of function the same in each one, but it's so cool how each era is very different, and it makes sense because each era was directed by a different person. The stories were written by different
Oh,
people,
wow.
and it's, I mean, I could go on for a long time about it, but I mean, it's a fabulous game. It's going to be my game of the year. I can already tell you that personally.
Wow.
It's not getting enough conversation. I don't think it's sold very well, which is really unfortunate. But if you haven't picked up Live a Live, I would just give it high marks.
Well, I
Nice.
think like I know Logan from TRG has been like sort of beating that drum as well, and
Hmm.
like some of the podcasts that I listen to, gaming related, like the people who have played it have just said like nothing but good things. But yeah, I don't think it's going to be. I'm not sure it's going to be like a commercial success. It's probably going to be more of a critical darling, but I mean, even hearing you talk about it, it's like that's one more sort of like nail in the coffin. Like eventually, like it's on my list of things to pick up and play.
Hmm.
Yeah, you've
You
been
will not be
reading.
disappointed by this game.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't think I will. Like I think yeah, I'm very much looking forward to it. And even hearing you talk about it, I'm like, yeah, sounds
It's
cool.
easy. It's not a hard game. It's an easy game. It's a charming game. I would describe it as almost like each story can be done in about an hour to like at a max 3 hours, usually about 2 hours. And so
Oh,
Okay.
it's
wow.
almost like a little nighttime story. You know, before you go to bed,
Hmm.
you could read through the whole story. And yet, despite only being 2 hours, in fact, I think the compactness forces them to have a real heart in each story that comes out. And again, each character is really unique. The game plays. I want to describe it, but I feel like I'm going to spoil it, so I'm not going to say anything more.
Mm, yeah. You've been reading or watching anything that's like, I mean, there's that's worth sharing or.
Yeah. I'm not much of a TV watcher. My digital entertainment format really is probably video games. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
voracious reader, so right now I'm reading a book called When Narcissism Comes to the Church by Chuck DeGroat. It's been a really good book. I've really enjoyed that. I'm also a big sci-fi fan. My favorite sci-fi author is an unknown guy. His name is Gene Wolfe, and so I'm reading a book by him. You've
I know who
probably
Gene
never
Wolfe
heard of
is.
him, but you know who Gene Wolfe is?
I know who Gene Wolfe is. Yeah.
Okay, do you hate Gene? You
No,
kind of
no,
hate him or you love him.
no, dude. He borders on sort of like the new weird absurdism that I really like. Like he's
Oh,
because he was it the is it the Executioner's Apprentice?
yeah. So he's the torturer's apprentice. So his most
That's the
famous
one.
series, what you're
Yeah.
describing, which is the series
Hmm.
is called The Earth of the New Sun. And there's a
Hmm.
bunch of peripheral series around it. I'm now in the third peripheral series, but it's, you know, it's the unreliable narrator.
Hmm.
It's an intentionally obtusely written book, and so you're constantly trying to figure out, is he lying to me? What is he describing right now? And so it's like a puzzle when you're reading it. And you're trying, so that's why some people hate it, absolutely hate it. I
No, I
love it.
liked it.
I
I
love
liked
it.
it. Yeah. It's I we'll at some point in time, you know, we can have a different conversation. But yeah, I like sort of like the new weird, and he is like proto new weird. So yeah,
Oh yeah.
I know who Gene Wolfe is,
Proto new
and
weird. So
yeah,
old weird? No, I don't know.
he
Proto
I
new.
think he was like at the very beginning of a lot of that. Like,
Just weird.
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah. I
so
knew the name rung a bell, but it was because you've talked about him.
hmm
Because in my head, Gene Wolfe just sounds like a werewolf that's like experimenting on creating a new person. So
you're the
Gene
worst,
Wolfe,
Josh.
you
That is
know,
true. That
mnemonic
is true.
devices.
He's a fascinating guy. He's either a Catholic or like a lapsed Catholic, and so his books
Oh wow.
always have these kind of strange Christian overtones. Like there's always savior figures, but they will say things and do things that very much so recall Jesus, except they're like terrible people. And so it's this
Mhm.
like weird mix of
Hmm.
Yeah.
you're getting this kind of New Testament thing going on, and yet also like totally messed up dudes. But I really love Gene Wolfe.
Nice.
Nah, I respect that. I respect it. Like, I respect and appreciate that. So, but
That's
Josh,
awesome.
what do you got for us?
Well, I've also been playing a nice bedtime story, charming video game before I go to bed. It's called Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice.
Mm.
Sorry, it is like the total opposite, the other end of the coin there. I'm still not far into the game, just a little bit into it. But I am cautiously optimistic for where it's going. I just have this big question mark hanging in the back of my head, because what it tries to do, it does very well. Play it with headphones, you get voices in your ears. The sound direction is amazing in this game, because these voices are like verging on whispers, but it sounds like they're speaking right into your ears because of how close they are to the microphone. It's just a different sound. It's a very different sound if you know what I'm talking about. So it is very effective in what it does. The thing that I'm still kind of like on the fence about, though, is that it's so surreal, the game itself, that I can't tell if this is just an analogy. Not that, oh, it's all a dream, but that like it's all in the character's head, or is it only half in the character's head and some of it's real? But if that's the case, it kind of jerks me out of it, because I'm like, well, if I can't tell what's real and what's fake, like I don't know. So I'm cautiously optimistic because I do like where it's going, and I don't want to just like write it off because of that. And I'm enjoying it because of how effective it is. But it does leave me questioning, like, are you trying to pull the rug out from under me? Like, what exactly is happening? I don't know what's happening. I'm just kind of along for the ride right now, and it is freaking me out a little bit. So but I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying the freak out. So, anyways, not too far into that one. And then in terms of reading, I brought it up last time, but I did finish up the 2000 Years of Christ Power by Nick Needham, that early church volume, and enjoyed that as well. It's one luckily I bought this one on Amazon. I do listen to a lot of my books through the library, but this one I actually purchased on Audible. So I'll be going through it multiple times, because it doesn't stick all the time. Like, you get an overview of early church history. They talk about these people. They talk about the different controversies, which is great. But when you have a physical book that you're reading, it sticks a little bit better. So it was really kind of, this first listen through was like an overview for me to get an idea. And I talked about it on the last episode, but it has given me a greater perspective for the emergence of different doctrines, different orthodox doctrines, and how like how complicated they tend to be. But also how we need to give grace and recognize not everyone can come to the same conclusions, like for different I'm saying, like, not everyone has thought these through, even come to the table with the same philosophical presuppositions. So anyways, there's all that there. We ought to show grace. We ought to point people to the truth. Definitely. 100%. I'm not saying be unorthodox. I'm just saying that, like, if someone doesn't have their orthodoxy all straightened out right now, it's okay. Show them grace, point them towards the scripture, preferably, but, the Holy Spirit will do that work. Come alongside them, teach them, but grace is a big part of that as well. Not everyone's going to agree with you on everything, and we get some examples of some bad things that happen from the past as well. And if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? So anyways, I did enjoy that, and I'll probably be going through it again periodically to remind myself of that as well. But yeah, outside of that, watching some Star Trek Next Generation, so early stuff, and enjoying that. But that's about it. That's all I got. Yeah. That's all it has on this report. So we're good.
And so I'm assuming there's no real updates to your beatdown score then. So
No, it has not changed. I'm looking forward to the day when, I'm enjoying Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Don't get me wrong, but it did hit me. My playtime's like 45 hours in. I'm like 2/3 maybe of the way into the game, so it's a pretty long game. So I'll get an extra point for that one when I do finally cross the finish line. But that's still going to take a little while.
yeah, well, cool. Cool. As far as what I've sort of been into, well, today I sat down with Deuce and Parker, and we finally we beat and rolled credits on Monster Hunter World. Uh, it was good. It's definitely like the story is kind of like, I mean, you're not playing that game for the story. Like you're playing it to like basically fight dinosaurs. Um,
Yeah,
and
like hunt monsters in a world, right?
hunt
Something
monsters in a world.
like
Yeah, pretty
like
much.
that. Yeah.
It's yeah. Um, I mean, the short version is I wish that the combat was a little more fluid. It does feel a little like clunky at times, but there's also supposed to
Mm.
be some weight there, as far as like combat and maneuverability. But yeah, it was fun. It was like it's so I logged that. Scored that out, and then promptly uninstalled it because I had to make room for Destiny 2. Um, yeah,
Mm.
because that's sort of that's going into the co-op pile. But yeah, as far as like single player stuff, just kind of trying to plunk away at Mother 3 still. I want
Mm.
to sort of I need to start maybe focusing on the single player stuff in are in my catalog a little bit more, especially since next month we're gonna basically there's a lot of stuff coming down the pipe as far as like episodes next month. So yeah, I gotta sort of put the pedal to the metal here, get on it. But yeah, that Mother Three's charming. Um, I really do sort of like love that. Yeah, I'm enjoying my time with that. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, my so like I said, I did beat Monster Hunter World, and that obviously will take my beatdown score to back to -5. As far as anything else that I've been playing, uh, or watching or reading, nothing worth noting as far as watching. Although a friend of the show, Josh Loftus, did say that the uh, the Lord of the Rings on Amazon Prime, he said the first 2 episodes were decent, and there's kind of been some back and forth on that. So honestly, I'm a little fatigued with all of like these properties. I don't know. I don't know where I'm at yet, like with that, but it's like out of all the different television stuff, I might check that out just to sort of come to my own conclusions. But he spoke well of it, so eh, I might check it out. But yeah, I'm not really watching anything as far as reading goes. Aside from finishing the wisdom pyramid the other week, I've kind of like stalled out, and it's been pretty light reading. Um, Man, Nate talk pretty someday. It's still working through the little golden book there.
Mhm.
Chapter 3 is kind of taken. It's just Calvin is he's weighty, and
Mm.
it's like 5 sentences, and I'm like, okay, now my head hurts. And so
Mhm.
I'm gonna just like take a break here for a little bit.
Yeah.
But
And you can go
yeah,
read Hobbes and come
yeah.
back.
Well, I'll just at that point in time,
Mhm.
instead of reading John Calvin, I'll just go read Bill Watterson, and yeah, not feel as bad about myself. Um, but yeah, so like I said, that's kind of just as far as like reading goes. It's kind of been a little bit light this last week or two. But yeah, like I said, my beatdown score is standing at 5. And speaking of the backlog beatdown, if you guys have been listening to the show for any amount of time, well, maybe if you've only listened to early episodes, you might not know this, but the official app of the backlog beatdown, that meta that we run all year long, uh, is GG. And it's a great little app for tracking your game collections. It's basically a letterboxed app for tracking game collections. You can create custom lists. You can rate and review games. You can sort of cultivate a friends list and see what your friends are playing. We know and love Charles. We love his product, and we just think that it's really worth a look at. And if you like it, there is a premium tier. The elite tier, you can for $5 a month or $50 a year, you can sort of get access to early builds. So you get first crack at new features. You get access to Charles on his Discord server. And yeah, It's like I said, we like the app, we like Charles, and we think that you might like it too. In other things that we like, or at least hope that you like, right? We have a Patreon, and if you've done the sharing and the caring, and you've subbed, you've rated and reviewed us, we would really, and you want to go a little bit further, right? You don't. This is totally optional. We don't want to like sort of press anybody into this, but you sort of like say, hey, I really like Josh and Nate. I really like what they're doing, and I want to support that, and maybe like have a little bit more access to them. You can sub to our Patreon for as little as $1 a month. You can get early and uncut access to every episode. You can get a video feed for every episode. You can get, well, access to us through the Patreon. You get an exclusive role in our Discord server. Yeah, and I don't know. You get the satisfaction for the price of less than a cup of coffee a month, that you're really helping out a couple of dudes who are just trying to do something worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
Lastly,
you might even be able to force us into playing a game, because that's happened a few times.
Yeah, that actually just happened, and it's a lot of what's going to be coming over the next couple months is as a result of that. But in other things that we like to sort of like maybe throw our weight behind and at least put on your guys' radar, Patrick wrote a book, and it's being published imminently. And we thought that we'd give him the opportunity to plug it here for you guys to maybe check out. So, Patrick, tell us a little bit about your book, man.
Yeah. So the book is called Truth Over Tribe, Pledging Allegiance to the Lamb, Not the Donkey or the Elephant. And the book is, as the title suggests, it's about tribalism. I think whether you are on the left or the right or somewhere in between, you've probably had some miserable experiences with tribalism in your life. Maybe it's anxiety that you feel at work because you can't be honest, or because you see there's a crusade happening against someone and you want to stop it, but you don't want to stand in the way. Maybe you've seen it break down family friendships or people that you really loved and cared about, but now you can't connect anymore because you're just not on the same side of the political aisle. Whatever it is, I think that the church should be at least one place where tribalism doesn't reign supreme. It should be the one place where Jesus reigns supreme. And, you go back to Jesus' ministry, and he had this constant habit of putting people together who were on the opposite side of the spectrum. He puts a zealot who's trying to, guerrilla warfare against Rome right next to Matthew, the tax collector, like a sympathizer with the Roman military and occupying forces. And he brings these people together. You think about Paul and his ministry of bringing Jews and Gentiles into the same room, into the same churches. And that was hard. I mean, it caused conflict, immense amounts of conflict. Much of the New Testament is dealing with that problem in these churches. And I think that the church, the way that we can witness to the power of Jesus over against the broken structures of the world is by being the place where he is in charge, where bridges are built that can't be built anywhere else, where a Trump supporter and a Biden supporter can be in the same small group. They can worship alongside each other. They can say what we share in common is more important than what separates us. And that is the heart of the book. We're trying to start a movement to end tribalism in the church. It's not a book trying to tell you which way you should vote. That's not the goal at all. The goal really is to help us become a group of people who put Jesus ahead of everything else in our life, including our political allegiances, which are increasingly becoming the idols of our era.
Mm-hmm. Dude,
for sure.
And just so the listeners are aware, I don't know if this will count I don't know if this will help you or not, but I did tell Patrick earlier that I already pre-ordered a copy on my Kindle. So I'm looking forward to this, and I would just maybe encourage you guys to sort of put this on your radar and maybe check it out.
Thanks for pre-ordering.
Yeah,
I hope people like the book.
Yeah, I'll need to do that pre-ordering as well, so that we can have a discussion about it too after it comes out, because that sounds pretty awesome. Yeah, we were talking a little bit before the podcast started, and I think that is just what a perfect topic for right now, like for our era. There's tons of books that you can read that have great information that is not very applicable nowadays, or it's great to just store away. Maybe you can make some connections here and there, but this is like if you've been listening to our podcast, we talk about this a little bit every once in a while as well, of just how we see this in the video game space, right? You get the console wars for no good reason, because frankly, consoles have never been as similar as they are today. But that's another soapbox we don't need to go down. So
Yeah.
I think this is going to be great. Especially just how, well, I was going to say gospel centered. I know that's a loaded term now, but how you're focusing on Jesus and how he unifies people as well. That's awesome. So I'm looking forward to it too. I just need to go ahead and push tap on my phone for a little while and pre-order it as well.
Yeah, we're excited for the book to come out. And while we don't talk about the console wars inside of the book, tribalism really is hardwired into humanity this side of the fall.
Mm,
And
yeah.
so, yeah, right now, political tribalism is a thing that I think needs to be discussed. But I can imagine that 10, 15 years from now, it's going to be something totally different. And
Yeah.
that, again, it's a book about tribalism. Yes, we have to get into politics, but we're not trying to prescribe your politics. We're trying to give you really practical steps in your life that you can take to turn down the temperature on the political discussion and build bridges
Yeah.
with people who are different than you.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's
Well, like I
awesome.
said, I think, Josh and I are both excited about that. And, I sometimes I get like into my like old man yelling at clouds kind of mode, and I get like a little cranked up about something. And like, yeah, I just want to like go like shake all the kids on the internet and,
Mm.
do all the old man things. But I'm excited about this because I think generally speaking, it is something that there's a lot of just divisiveness all over the place, especially prevalent on social media. And in a lot of ways, we need, like, social media isn't real life in a lot of ways, right? But it's also like, if we can sort of recapture the ability to just have civil discourse, again, with just people around us, like, I'm all about that. So yeah,
Yeah,
looking forward to
it's
it, man.
that we hope we make a tiny dent in that conversation, and I hope, like you just said, it does produce more civil discourse. I, Look, social media and the internet is generally speaking an awful place, but that's also precisely the place that I think Jesus would have us go. And so,
Mm.
if we can model how to disagree charitably inside the church, I mean, you just brought up theological debates in the book that you're reading, and
Mhm.
the church has a long history of very heated arguments over theological topics, and so there's a place for that. And yet, I think the examples that we want to follow are not those who said we're gonna burn people on the stake or the Spanish Inquisition. But like there's all these different approaches to how you're going to handle these dialogues, and that's what we're advocating for: is a charitable discussion where we assume the best about each other. We don't
Mhm.
deploy a hermeneutic of suspicion. We show, like just like basic Jesus stuff of, humility and gentleness and meekness, that kind of stuff that he calls us to, loving our enemies. Like, I think if that characterized our dialogue and our conversation, we'd have really fruitful conversations, and we'd actually convince and persuade people that he is who he said he is.
Mhm.
No, right on. Um, well, shifting gears and sort of moving into something that is not nearly as sober as that. Let's sort of just move right along here into the main topic. And so I've referenced it. I've referenced it. Oh, Nate talk pretty. It's going to be so good. Much wow. I have referenced the Twitter thread that we kind of that sort of kicked all of this off. But actually, I just thought, and when you asked what we would talk about, I said, well, let's look at this Twitter thread, because I think there's some really useful information in here and some good sort of jumping off points to have a serious conversation. Because I think some of what you, so some of what you're doing in this thread and what we try to do over here is have a serious conversation and sort of shed facts on, at times, so you more so in this Twitter thread than us on the show, but have a serious discussion about video games and the potential impact that they have. So if you guys don't mind, I have it already pulled up here, and I just figured I'd sort of run down through tweet by tweet, and we could just sort of maybe interact with these. So you open up the thread with saying basically, fact one: gaming is larger than Hollywood and the music industry combined. And you have 180 billion, sort of type behind that. And I'm imagining that's video games gross revenue for the year.
Yes,
So
correct.
that is a
Yeah.
very large number. you know, um,
It is not small.
it is not small at all. And I don't have the numbers for like, Hollywood or the music industry, but I do remember sort of when you tweeted, when I read that, I did go out and look it up, and it's surprisingly what is arguably the most pervasive forms, at time, or what seemingly the most dominant forms of media don't make as much money
Hmm.
as the video game industry. So, I think that's just an interesting little bit of note, or a little bit of information to take note of. But then you go on to say, fact two, you'll be hard pressed to find serious engagement with games in major media outlets, secular or Christian. And again, we were sort of, before we even started recording, we were sort of talking about how, like, unfortunately, like, and I like fan sites, just like, well, actually, I'm kind of like over games journalist in a lot of ways, but that's a kind of a different story altogether. But
Mm.
I like games
I
media.
was just
I
yeah,
want to like
I was
games
just gonna say
media.
I think it is related. I think the reasons behind you not liking games journalism actually plays into this a lot. But
Well,
anyways,
yeah, no, because it's a lot of it turns into either they're sort of, a lot of the articles are sort of like, not to be crass, but like I remember seeing one article from, and I don't remember which one it was, but it was like the thrust of the article was like, Cyberpunk 2077 has a genitalia adjustment slider. And I was like, that's the most interesting thing that you can write about. Like, for this, somebody, and that was like a, an entire article, like, and it's maybe 2,000 words, I don't know, was spent on that. And I was just going like, wow, that's ridiculous. But it's sort of, it's a lot of like the sort of like the political sort of gestures, and the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? We say it all the time, like the virtue signaling, almost like, sort of, there's a lot of
mhm.
that sort of crops up in the media, and it's not actually trying to engage the media based on its own merits. It's either saying this game sucks because it doesn't have the same agenda that I do, or
There's too much
Yeah.
whatever.
water.
There's
It's
yeah.
uh, I feel like games media is going through what media in general is going through, especially
Yeah.
large scale. You think about the New York Times or the Washington Post. Um, the model has dramatically changed. It used to be that Fox News was cable news, but now everything is cable news. And the key to make money for these organizations, that they have to be highly targeted. And what they want to do is pull in the most affluent, wealthy people to read their things, so that they can sell ads to those people, to those who want to sell ads, get them to buy their stuff. And as it turns out, wealthy, affluent people tend to be college educated. They tend to be left or left of center, generally speaking. And that might not really be the gaming audience, by the way, which I find to be really fascinating. And so they're having to play to a particular group. And of course, that also means that forces game developers to play in the same game. I mean, there's no greater symbol of this for me than just look at The Last of Us Part 1 versus The Last of Us Part 2, and the changes that happen between those games. Now, I really liked both games, but The Last of Us Part 2 has all of these weird cultural axes to grind. Like, you've got, it's talking about lesbian relationships and a trans kid, and all these things are happening inside of the story, and they don't even really make sense, right? Because like the zombie apocalypse happened in 2010. Like 2010, most Americans weren't for gay marriage. Like 2010, most people didn't even know what the
Mm,
word trans meant, right? But now I'm
yeah.
supposed to believe, like, 15 years later in the future, everybody's become woke despite not having this media apparatus around us. But again, the broader point that I think we have to wrestle is that games media is going through what all media is going through, which is they have to appeal to an audience, which I do think plays into Christian media ignoring games, because there's this
Mm.
stigma around the thing, that they think that we're not going to be taken seriously. I mean, like, Christ in pop culture is a great example of this. Pop culture, like, what could be more pop culture than video games? I'm pretty sure their last video, and I'm not trying to dog, I love what they do there, but I'm pretty sure the last video game review was like 2 or 3 years ago.
Mm,
And this is the biggest pop culture industry in the world. There's something about that we have to
Mm.
wrestle with as Christians. And I think part of it's just targeting, that they think they're not going to be taken seriously by their audience if they engage with this kind of content.
yeah. Well,
Mm.
and I would agree there too. Yeah, it's like it's almost you feel well. It's like you said they're sort of playing to their advertisers versus sort of generating substantive content, and it's like I think and I don't know how familiar you are with him or not, but Colin Moriarty, he was over at IGN for a while. He's part of Kind of Funny, and he's spun off and done his own Patreon thing, and he's got one of the most successful video game Patreons. He's got one of the most successful Patreon campaigns on the platform, and I think he's doing it because he does sort of eschew a lot of the just the
Mhm.
nonsense that accompanies everything. And he talks about games, and whether you agree with him or not, he's got an opinion on and he's got a fairly robust pedigree as well. Like he's been writing and playing games for you know uh, 10, 15, 20 years. And we were fortunate enough to actually have him on and sort of pick his brains a little bit. And it was a really interesting conversation. Now,
Mm.
I would disagree with some of the places he lands, but at the same time, it's like he's doing something right, because there are a lot of people who are like into what he says. And he's not playing the political game. All he does is
Mhm.
talk about video games. That's it.
Mhm.
Which, by the way, is what you should do if you're a video game journalist. That's
Yeah.
the description of the job. And you're bringing, again, what we're seeing is this cottage industry of Substacks, Patreons, all these
Mm.
small shops open up because
Mm.
it's called audience capture. It's the point at which your audience begins to control your content in really unhealthy ways. So, like a great illustration of this, there was this YouTuber. His whole shtick was he was like a vegan who played violin for the camera, and he didn't get any followers doing this. And so he tosses out his veganism and just starts eating meals and talking to the camera. And his audience starts growing, but they start kind of saying, "Hey, you should eat this, or you should eat that." And over time, he starts eating entire fast food menus in one sitting. And if you looked at a picture of him when he started, he's like this tiny little skinny vegan dude, and now he's like 400 pounds, has to have like a breathing system apparatus on his face so that he can
Mm.
breathe. And it's like he literally ate himself. Like the person he was has been devoured, and now he's become this monster that's been captured by his audience, where his audience controls him. And again, so it's like you're playing to advertisers, but you're also playing to the audience. And if the advertisers want a elite, educated, certain kind of the high spending audience, guess what they're going to play to? That's going to be
Yeah.
the audience that captures them. And so you begin allowing that audience to shape the kind of coverage that you're going to give. I think it's ironic with video games because, the video gaming community is not what I would describe generally as a highly progressive community. But if you look at a lot of the major outlets, that seems to be the direction that they're going.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. It, a couple episodes ago, we had a conversation with another friend of ours, Eric Bryant, and we talked about video games as toys, and the perception of video games as
Mhm.
toys, and in the recognition that there was a day when that was primarily what video games were, and they've grown a lot since then. But do you think that plays into this? I mean, it's kind of a strong word, but stigma as well. So you're throwing out like this is an amazingly huge industry, and it actually has a lot of cultural power. I mean, like I heard a few years ago that around the world, Mario is more recognizable than Mickey Mouse. So,
Mm.
something like this, and that Pokemon is the highest selling franchise of all time, like intellectual property of all time. Things like this where video gaming is actually a lot bigger than we tend to recognize. Is there? Have you found reasons why it carries this? In that sense, in the sense that I brought up the conversation, I would say there is a bit of a stigma that it's childish, that it is more of just it's a toy for younger mind, for man children,
Mhm.
something like that, as opposed to something that most people at this point kind of engage in, that is in a huge industry, that is a culture shaper in certain ways. what are some of the reasons you think people don't recognize how ubiquitous gaming is?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question, and I mean, I think the answer is just history, and in
Mhm.
America in particular, there's a long history of this. So there's this. If you go back to the 1800s, there was a Victorian ethos around art. You know, you had to be wealthy because there was no
Mm.
vinyl. You couldn't listen to things. You had to bring an artist into your house to play the music so that you could enjoy it. You have to go to, the concert hall and be able to afford doing something like that to enjoy a play because there's no movies. Um, and as I mean, this is where pop culture came from. Was there was this slow technological transition where now all of a sudden I could listen to something inside my house, or something could be broadcasted onto a TV, or even in fiction, right? Like I could get, because printing became cheaper and cheaper over time, I could get a book for really cheap. This is where we get the term penny dreadful. They weren't dreadful because they were
Mm.
like pornographic books. They were dreadful because the, highfalutin Victorian society thought themselves above that kind of culture. And so in
Mm.
America, we've always had a kind of mixed relationship with pop culture in general.
Mm.
And then I think you add in another element, which is that America has always had this. You have tech utopians and tech dystopians. So like when the Industrial Revolution happens, you have people who are trying to burn down these factories because they see them as an existential threat to their lives, and not just their livelihoods. They think it's changing the way that we live. And so you have a pop culture's anathema. It's immature. We have this dystopian thing, which especially has gotten into Christianity. Christians are very skeptical of technology in general. And then you fast forward to the 70s and 80s, and you look at where this stuff came out of. And I mean, it literally came out of toy and game manufacturers.
Mhm.
Nintendo was a card
Yep.
game company that
Mhm.
made this little gun thing for games. It was a child company, right? And again, the world that all of the early video games came out of were largely, you'd go to a bar and play. I forget what it's called, the game where you shoot the ball up into the thing, and it's got the
Oh,
little
yeah, yeah.
paddles.
There.
Or pinball.
Not skee ball. It's the I
Oh.
forget what it's called. One of your listeners will, anyways, these were the early manufacturers of video games because they kind of saw it as the next thing. But again, it was viewed as something that was, it was done largely in poor neighborhoods, inside of bars. It was not viewed as a high form of society. And so,
Mm.
you get into the 80s, and especially because console games were incredibly limited in the amount of memory that they could store, you had to have fairly, not complex games. I mean, tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons really created the format for the modern RPG. I mean, they worked it
Yeah.
out in a profound way in the 70s. Like we're still kind of catching up, but because you couldn't put, I mean, this is where roguelike games come from. It's like you can't put a whole RPG onto a floppy disk. And so you pick
Mm.
one element and you major on it. And so that means that you end up getting really thinned out stories. You end up getting more unidimensional experiences that were largely appealing to kids. And the last thing is, again, it's a Western thing. In Japan, it was more widely embraced amongst adults. But in the West, I mean, consoles almost never, they almost didn't happen. There was the console boom in the mid 80s, and then everybody's trying to make a console, and then they all flopped. And then everybody thought this is the end of video games. Like, they're not
Right.
going to happen anymore. And Nintendo comes out of it, but they come out of it by creating, and you just brought up Mario, by creating this character who's very appealing to children. And so when you go forward from there, and you have, again, thinned out stories, you have a burgeoning new genre, you already have a society that's skeptical of technology and pop culture, and the advertising is clearly appealing to children. The industry is what created the notion that this is for kids.
Mhm.
That's where I think it came from. And
Mm.
Christians never kind of moved past that. In fact, they had a lot of skepticism around it because of the violence in games. I remember Columbine. I think it was in fourth,
Okay,
fifth
that's a good
grade.
point.
People said this
Mhm.
guy played Doom. And that's where they got the idea to shoot up their school. And so I think that's part. So again, that doesn't explain the whole Christian thing, but I think there's a historical thing that happened with video games that we have to wrestle with. And I think it's where this notion of childishness really came from.
Mhm. Yeah, that's
Mm.
that's good, and I do think I will say, that, like, I agree with everything that you were talking about, but I will say also in a certain sense, it is, and you alluded to this actually in your tweet, it is both in I would say, the secular realm and the Christian realm. The Christian realm is farther behind in really trying to engage in the medium in a
Mm.
thoughtful way. I do feel like there is a very similar stigma, and it's for a lot of these reasons that you're talking about as well. It's not purely Christian, because like towards the end there, I'm thinking, oh yeah, satanic panic, especially with things like D&D kind of like filtering into it, because there were a certain sect of adults who played games as well, but then it was more of that type, I guess. So anyways, all that to say is I do think it's kind of by and large, I think there are some people who are not within the church who would still say that, like, okay, why are you playing those kids games? Still have that kind of idea, that kind of stigma. It's not, I don't think it's fully accepted by by and large. It still seems so. It's like you kind of peer under the rock and you see, oh, it's this huge industry, which is, yeah, it's just a really interesting place that we're in right now. Although I fully agree. Yeah, that I would say the Christian world is farther behind in its recognition and willingness to engage in having these thoughtful conversations. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
those
it
are all good
really is across
points.
the board. If you get a
Mhm.
paper copy of the New York Times, you'll find reviews of local plays happening on and off Broadway
Mhm.
that the vast majority of people in the United States have no access to. But this is high culture, and so we're going to
Yeah.
talk about high culture here. And you will find next to nothing in that print copy about video games that are being played by millions and millions of people. Now, I mean, look,
Mhm.
just because lots of people play it doesn't mean that it's worthy of discussion. Lots of people
Right.
watch pornography, and I don't want to have a podcast about pornography. So that
Mhm.
doesn't justify it. My problem with, and this is especially true in Christian circles, is that it's not engaged because they haven't thought seriously about the medium.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
they've thought deeply maybe about film or television or novels and books, and we've developed categories for thinking Christianly about these particular things. But because they haven't thought deeply about how video games actually work, how they function as a medium of communication, as a medium of
Yep.
storytelling, they just assume it's thin, it's weak. And so that's why I love talking to people who have this view. I mean, if I know them in person, I'll bring them over, like, hey, I'm gonna make you play this, the first 15 minutes of this game, and then you
Mhm.
tell me if you think this is a thin medium for storytelling.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
and I think that's sort of like, that's well, we'll sort of move on ahead here because you actually did sort of bring this up in a Twitter thread. You said if you meet a Christian cinephile who writes reviews of the movies, he or she will be taken seriously. If that same person reviews a cultural artifact with much broader appeal, i.e., video games, she will get this. And then you had the sort of one. You used a New Girl gif, and I my wife and I have enjoyed
Yeah.
New Girl.
Zoe Deschanel looking askance, like, oh gosh,
That's
we're having this conversation, huh?
yeah, yeah, that's mm.
There's the
And
back door.
yeah, kind of like looking for the exit. But I would sort of say, like, I think part of the general problem is that exactly, like, is that a lot of, even like, sort of harkening back to what we were talking a little bit about a little bit ago, a lot of the oh geez, yeah, I'm falling apart here. A lot of the conversation surrounding games in general on Christian and secular sides is pretty immature. It's juvenile. It's trying to it's not taking the medium seriously. Whereas, and because that's kind of what sells. That's what gets the most attention. But if you have someone who is trying to engage it, and again, trying to just engage the things a little more critically, it's not as much fun. It's not as soundbitey. It's not as whatever. And so a lot of times, like, at church, sometimes I'll talk about, I don't talk about my podcast a whole lot. It's not because I'm ashamed of the work that we do. It's just, I know the response I'm going to get, and it's not to sort of,
You can say you're ashamed of me.
no,
That's okay. You
like,
don't have to.
yeah, oh man, that's a whole different ball of wax there, buddy. Um, but like, and my pastor and my elders know, and we've talked about it. And I say, like, part of it
Yeah.
is really there's a lot of like meaningful sort of context to be drawn out of this, because it is such a powerful narrative tool. And there's a lot of things happening, like, even sort of going back to that. It's one of the largest. It's $180 billion industry a year, right? Like that's a lot of money. That's a big imprint, that's a big footprint, and it's having the like these stories and these experiences are having impact on our kids and on, you know, our neighbors. And it's like, there's a lot of exposure there. And if you're not willing to sort of like treat it, you know, and again, like some games are just like you mentioned Doom, like, right. I really like Doom 2016 from a technical, like it's a really just masterfully put together game. Like the combat loops, and it's just like, it's just a dopamine terror rush that but right. And it's like, yeah, I think Doom Eternal, the sequel, was actually called Murder Chess. You know, I don't know how you murder demons, you know, but anyway, you know, you're killing like monsters or whatever, and there's like, but and so like, yeah, that's like sort of dumb fun in a way. You know, it does require a sort of a technical prowess, like an ability, and there's and I appreciate the design behind it, but I'll like say narratively, it's kind of like empty. But there's other things like, you know, you mentioned The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2. There's really meaty narrative in there that you can sort of like dig into, and there's a lot of like things to critically pull apart and look at. But you can't do that. You know, I one of the most interesting things that I've seen is that somebody actually compared The Last of Us Part 2 to Schindler's List. And a lot of people freaked out, and it was I'm trying to Jeff Kanata. He has it from DLC. He's got a couple he's got a bunch of anyways, he compared it in one of his tweets to Schindler's List, and he basically said like it's sort of on that level for the video game equivalent. And he's like, listen, I'm not going to watch Schindler's List for fun. I'm going to watch Schindler's List because it has, there's a beauty in that, and there's a mastery in it, and it has things to say to me. And he's like, and I play The Last of Us Part 2 for the same reason. There's a beauty in it. There's a mastery in it. That's sort of like, you see the creative genius behind this team, and it has things to say. And
yeah, it's got profound things to say. And I think, you know, that's the part that drives me nuts is if you haven't engaged with the medium, you're not going to realize that. You know, I said I like to let people play the first 15 minutes of a game and then see what they think. The game I have them play is The Last of Us Part 1. For a number of reasons. Number one, if they haven't
opening
played
15 minutes is heartbreaking.
Yes. It's everything about it is different, right? So I mean, like if you grew up playing video games, first of all, the character you start with is the hero of the story. So you open up the game and you're a 13-year-old girl. Well, you know, in my life, I had never played as a 13-year-old girl in any video game. And I'm, you know, and it's masterful, right? Because she's walking through the house and she's seeing pictures of her and her dad. And you put together that something's happened to her mom. And you can tell that there's a special relationship between her and her father because she's got memorabilia of him. And she hears this voice. There's all these things that are coming through that are showing this special relationship. And then, you know, obviously out of nowhere, you start hearing these zombie voices and gunshots, and he breaks in. And it's terrifying because you can't see anything. And, you know, most games you're able to fight, like, but she can't do anything, you know, like you're completely unable. And you jump into a car and like basically all you're doing is reacting to thing after thing. And as it goes through, you're falling in love with this relationship between her and her father. And this, you know, maybe it's because I was a new dad at the time too. Like I felt this profound protectiveness, like I have to protect this girl, and I'm playing as the girl. And of course, in the end of the first 15 minutes, she gets shot and killed, and he can't protect his daughter. And I'm not kidding. I bawled. I wept. I didn't know anything about the game, and so I didn't see it coming, you know, so it just completely caught me off guard. And it sets up, you know, the entire rest of the game, which is, you know, essentially a little buddy game with profound themes around what is a parent, what is a child, what are human relationships, what makes us love one another, you know, what happens when we're, you know, when we've survived a trauma and we need to build relationship, but we can't because there's something that's still broken. So it's like all these things that we all wrestle with in our life. And you're going to tell me that's not a serious genre? Like there's nothing serious happening here. You just play that first 15 minutes and it will turn you around. And so again, that's why for me, that's a conversation I want to have. I want to talk about the medium. And my last little thought there is, you have to talk about it as its own medium, because, you know, some people don't like lots of, they call it like playing a movie or something. And that drives me nuts because I don't think you're playing a movie in the game. There's parts that feel like that, sure.
Mhm.
But like part of what a game does that is unique from a film or reading or any other entertainment format is the feedback loop between player and game. It's the ability to enter
Yeah.
into the game, into the game feel of I move the controller and something happens on the screen, and that actually affects you in a different way. It's a different format of storytelling that you will never experience watching TV. And so again, if you want to take
Right.
the medium seriously, you have to reflect on how it actually forms and shapes the individual playing it, and the power that comes from that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like in the most basic level. You remember choose your own adventure books when you were a kid? It's like that is different than reading a regular story, just
Mhm.
just that little bit of interaction there. And especially for games that are trying to put kind of that have profound themes in them. um I think it makes it all the more impactful that you were a part of that experience, that you were bringing some things about in the world. Yes, of
Yeah.
course it's an illusion, but so is every character you've ever read about in a fiction book. You know what I mean? Like, so are
It's
the
no different.
Pevensey kids in the Narnia trilogy, but they're still awesome characters. Like,
Yeah, like one example that comes to my mind with this, I've shared this on other podcasts, but I've already said I love Final Fantasy VII.
mhm.
Spoiler alert! But if you don't know this spoiler, you don't know anything about video games. uh, in the center of the game, the main character's love interest, Cloud's love interest, Aerith, she is killed by Sephiroth. But the scene leading up to that is you're playing as Cloud, and at this point, Cloud continually loses control over himself.
Hmm.
He seems to be able to be taken over by the villain in some sense. Which, okay, like as a sidebar, like how interestingly Christian is that as a worldview of like, Romans 7, I can't do the thing that I want to do, but whatever, let's just
Mhm.
set that aside. And what happens is she's on this pedestal praying, and Sephiroth is taking Cloud over, and he's clearly directing Cloud over there to kill her. And this is the only point of the game where you can't tell Cloud where to go, right? So like if you press any button on the controller, if you move him, he takes another step towards her with his sword, like ready to kill her. And I remember in the moment playing the game, like I don't want to kill her. Like what? And I'm like trying to go backwards, and every time I press backwards, he's like going forwards. I'm like trying to, like, I don't know what to do, and everything I did, he's moving closer and closer and closer. And it's like I'm literally fighting with myself. I don't want to do this, and then
Mhm.
he somehow stops right at the last second. But just stop and think about that. I literally had to enter into he didn't want to kill her. He didn't
Mhm.
want to do this thing. And the emotion in that moment of I don't want this thing to happen, but there's nothing that I can do to stop it was actually escalated by the feedback loop that was happening between me and the character on screen. That is profound storytelling. And you cannot get that
Mhm.
by watching the movie version. You cannot get the experience I had of I don't want to do this, but there's nothing I can do to stop it. You cannot have that. And so again, like that's where I'm saying, like you have to talk about it as a medium, as a genre that is unique and can do things that other genres simply can't do.
Mhm.
Well, and
Yeah.
it's interesting that you talk about like it's basically the player's agency sort of
Mm.
is kind of there in that moment, because that reminds that sort of that moment there where you're talking about Cloud and sort of like every step is even that's even more sort of like forced mechanically on you, because it's like any interaction pushes you forward like with the controls, which and to sort of a similar moment, if you've ever played BioShock, is the would you kindly reveal, where it's like there is this moment where the game just sort of stops, and the only way to move forward is to basically sort of give in, on a like it's sort of not really fourth wall breaking, but like it interacts with the player in a way. It says like the only way forward is to basically sort of submit to the sort of what the game's sort of been telling you the whole time, and
Mhm.
that and it's just, but yeah, the sort of the intensity of that moment wouldn't, like, if you're watching that in a movie, that's you're gonna be like, oh, whatever. But the fact that like it's the player's agency, like I'm the one who actually is like pulling the trigger, pressing the button. I'm the one driving this forward, even though I don't want to,
Yeah.
or even though and so that is a very interesting sort of like, and I think that that really sort of plays in the fact that, like, in a lot of ways, like, this is a, it's not just the immersion, but it is the fact that, like, yeah, there is that the player feedback loop. It's the player is the active agent, sort of like you are in that game in a way that you aren't in a story. Like, I think there are probably things about reading that are probably a little bit more beneficial than video games at times, but
Sure.
video, even reading to a certain extent, is pretty passive. It's a little more sort of like creative. There's a lot more creative input versus like watching a movie. But like, because instead of like, ripping out, like, you're building the worlds in your mind, whereas, you're watching the screen, it's built, like, there's set design and visual effects artists they've built all that out for you. Like, you're building your own soundtrack, you're building your own actors. When you're reading something, coming at it sort of like that, we call it a naked playthrough sometimes in gaming, where it's like you don't look at anything, but like there's when you come at a book the first time, like, and it's just you and the page, like, you're building that, but like, and so you're not quite doing that, but the way you're interacting with it, you're a lot more almost physically tied, or not physically, but psychologically tied to this game,
Mm.
versus the way, like, because even in the book, like, you mentioned that you're reading Gene Wolfe. Yeah, there are questions in there that narratively he sort of like gets you, the reader, to sort of engage in. But at the same time, like, there's still only one path through that book. There's no point, like, unless you just put the book down. It's like you're going to go through that story the way he's told it. And when somebody's interacting with a game in a way, there are, especially like, there's obviously linear experiences, right? Like, sometimes the story is the story is the
Mhm.
story, and the way that you experience might be different than person X, Y, and Z. And then there's the whole issue of emergent gameplay with things like Skyrim and stuff like that. But I think, like, we do undermine or underestimate the weight, and like the sort of like the the sort of, again, I'm going to use the term, the weight that this sort of puts on video games, and the way that we play them, is that
Mm.
sometimes, like, I think that, you mentioned the scene with Aerith, like that, like a profound moment where it just sort of hits you, like, and you're just like, I don't want to do this. And that puts you in that headspace. And there's, I think, all this being said, like, it's just interesting because, like, there are books and songs and things that sort of capture those moments too. But like, for me, the one of the games that, like, I love Shadow of the Colossus. That's like one of my favorite games of all time. That's more of a sort of, it's a design thing more than anything, just because it is designed by subtraction. But the game that I would sort of say most recently had the largest emotional impact was, I played God of War, the God of War reboot, from back in 2018 or 2016, whenever that was. And the sort of, to set the stage, like, we were fostering two boys with the intent to adopt them. And that went sideways. Um, it just, for a lot of reasons, it didn't really work out. But I'm playing this game as, like, that's basically a story about fathers and sons, which I think in a lot of ways every dude on the face of the planet has, like, sort of like this, like, that's like sort of weak spot for us. Like, we just, like, it's like fathers and sons, because we were all a son. So you might have daddy issues, or we have sons, or whatever. You know what I'm saying? There's a whole, like, there's a way that we can relate to that story in particular. And I just remember watching this, and just to give you, like, I'm a dude who has struggled with anger his entire life. Like, that's the one that I sort of default to. And so that's,
Mm.
um and by the grace of God, like, I'm maturing out of a lot of that. And and but I just, there were a lot of parallels for me, because I saw Kratos, who's a dude who is basically defined by his anger in those first three, like, he is angry and he kills things. And then he's actually sort of has to deal with all of the fallout of that. And then and all of the destruction that he's wrought, and all of the bad relationships that he has. And all of a sudden, like, he's got, like, a son. And he's got to model sort of what it means to be a responsible man, but he also has to like ready this boy, equip this boy for Atreus for survival in a world that will very easily destroy him, and at the same time, like he wants to keep things from him, and like he's trying to protect him, and in doing so he causes him harm, and it's just there's so much in there that like I was like there's just sort of like yeah. And like that game for me, just like it was just sort of like walking through that story and even watching Kratos be redeemed in a lot of ways and sort of like become a better man by sort of even sort of like reconciling who he was and saying, well, not everything about me like before this needs to be discarded. Like there are parts like I was a warrior, I was a fighter, and I was a fighter for a reason. And it's like turning the fight and saying like, I will fight to protect my son. I will fight for a just cause instead of just to like crush those who stand in my way. And like that whole thing, like the emotional impact, like, it just sort of like locked, like, I would say like that's my most recent, but it's like, dude, like I could read, Josh, you read Cormac McCarthy's The Road recently.
That
And
broke me, dude. Yes.
and
I did.
when I just like in a way, like The Road, I've read The Road and I was like, it's an interesting, I read it very analytically, kind of, but it's like, it didn't twist me up the way that God of War did for some reason, and maybe it was just, it was sort of like, I read it at the right time or read it at the wrong time and played the game at the right time or whatever. But I'm just sort of like weighing in there and just saying like, hey, like there's something here that needs to be reckoned with and needs to be reckoned with seriously.
It's I feel like it's all over the place, I guess just I could go game after game. Like I don't know if you guys played Ghost of Tsushima or Tsushima. I don't know how to pronounce
Tsushima,
the
yeah,
island.
yeah.
Tsushima, thank you. I should know. They have good voice acting. But
Well,
I
that
suppose I've got
TS thing is like you almost
I
have to
know.
like kiss the T just a little bit. That
Tsushima.
Yeah, that's or you could just think of it as Ghost of Sushi Man and take away the N at the end. It's
Oh,
Ghost of Tsushima.
Tsushima. That'll
Sorry,
help
I'm
me.
trying to ruin everything.
That's
he's
good.
the worst, Patrick. He's the worst. Don't
I
encourage him.
love sushi. I'm the sushi man. Wait, no, but so like it's like I could go through examples like so there's a game that's about honor culture and it's about the right way to fight, and a true samurai faces his enemy face to face. There's honor in the fight. It's better to die with honor than do the dishonorable thing, and it's a stealth fighter game, right? And so like literally the way the game introduces you to stealth mechanics is this existential crisis of the character trying to wrestle with the kind of person he